오늘은 책 읽기만 일단은 30분을 좀 해보겠습니다. Culture map. So I might assume, but suppose you happen to speaking with 20 or 30 French managers living in the United States, and you heard similar stories from the dozens of them, as they explained one by one how their American bosses gave them negative feedback in a way they found confusing, ambiguous, or downright misleading. You might come to the correct conclusions that there is something cultural driving this pattern of misunderstanding. And in fact, such a pattern does exist, which strongly suggests that the case of Deaf Duloc is much more than a matter of personality conflict. This pattern is puzzling because Americans often do tend to be more explicit and direct than the French, or more precisely, more low context, a term we'll explore further in a later chapter. The one big exception arises when managers are providing the feedback to their subordinates. In a French setting, positive feedback is often given implicitly, while negative feedback is given more directly. In the United States, it's just the opposite. American managers usually give positive feedback directly while trying to couch negative messages in a positive, encouraging language. Thus, when Weber reviewed Duloc's work using the popular American methods of 3 positives for every negative, Duloc left the meeting with his phrase ringing delightfully in her ears, while the negative feedback sounded very minor indeed. If Duloc had been aware of this cultural tendency when discussing her job performance with her new American boss, she might have weighed the negative part of the review more heavily than she would if receiving it from a French boss, thereby reading the feedback more accurately and potentially saying her job. Armed with the same understanding, Weber could have reframed his communications for Duloc. He might have said, "When I give a performance review, I always start by going through 3 or 4 things I feel the person is doing well. Then I move on to the really important part of the meeting, which is, of course, what you can do to improve. I hate to jump into the important parts of the meeting without starting with the positives. Is that method okay for you?" Simply explaining what you are doing can often help a lot, both by diffusing an immediate misunderstanding and laying the foundation for better teamwork in the future, a principle we also saw at work when Bo Chun described his reasons for remaining silent during most of the meeting. This is one of the dozens of the concrete, practical strategies we'll provide for handling cross-cultural missteps and improving your effectiveness in working with the global teams. invisible boundaries that divide our world. Situations like the two we've just considered are far more common than you might suspect. The sad truth is that the vast majority of managers who conducted the business internationally have little understanding about how culture is impacting their work. This is especially true as more and more of us communicate daily with the people in other countries over virtual media like email or telephone. When you live, work, or travel extensively in a foreign country, you pick up a lot of contextual cues that help you understand the culture of the people living there. And that helps you to better decode it, decode communications and adapt accordingly. By contrast, when you exchange emails with an international counterparts in a country you haven't spent time in, it is much easier to miss the cultural subtle ties impacting the communication. A simple example is the characteristic behavior unique to India, a half shake, half nod of the head. Travel to India on business, and you'll soon learn that the half shake, half nod is not a sign of disagreements, uncertainty, or lack of support, as it would be in most cultures. Instead, it suggests interest, enthusiasm, or something respectful listening. After a day or two, you notice that everyone is doing it. You make a mental note of its apparent meaning, and you're able henceforth to curate with the gesture when negotiating a deal with your Indian outsourcing team. But over email or telephone, you may interact daily with your Indian counterparts from your office in Hellerup, Denmark, or Bogota, Colombia, without ever seeing the situations they live and work in. So, you're in a video conference with one of your top India managers. You may interpret his half shake, half nod as meaning that he is not in a full agreement with your idea. You redouble your efforts to convince him, but the more you talk, the more he seemingly indicates with his head he is not on board. 이 부분에 대해서는 인디안 컬처에 대해서 파악을 할 수가 있는 부분이죠. Half node is not the agreement. Isn't that underboard? So you get off the cold puzzles, frustrated and perhaps angry. Culture has impacted your communications, yet in the absence of the visual and contextual cues that physical presence provides, you didn't even recognize that something cultural was going on. So, whenever we are aware of it or not, subtle differences in our communications patterns and the complex variations in what is considered good business or common sense from one country to other have a tremendous impact on how we understand one another and ultimately on how we get the job done. Many of these cultural differences, varying the attitudes concerning when best to speak or stay quiet, and the role of the leader in the room, and what kinds of negative feedback is the most constructive, may seem small. But if you are unaware of the differences and unarmed with the strategies for managing them effectively, they can derail your team meetings, demotivated your employees, frustrated your foreign suppliers, and in dozens of other ways make it much more difficult to achieve your goals. Today, whether we work in the Düsseldorf or Dubai, Brasilia or Beijing, New York or New Delhi, we're all part of the global network, rare or virtual, physical or electronic, where success requires navigating through widely different cultural realities. Unless we know how to decode our cultures, and avoid easy to fall into cultural traps. We're easy prey to misunderstanding, needless conflict, and ultimate failure. Being open to individual differences is not enough. It is quite possible, even common, to work across cultures for decades and travel frequently for business while remaining unaware and uninformed about how culture impacts you. Millions of people work in the global settings while viewing everything from their own cultural perspectives and assuming that all differences, controversy, and misunderstanding are rooted in personality. This is not due to laziness. Many well-intentioned people don't educate themselves about cultural differences because they believe that if they focus on the individual differences, that will be enough. After I published an online article on the differences among Asian cultures and their impacts on cross-Asian teamwork, one reader commented, "Speaking of the cultural differences leads us to stereotype and therefore put individuals in boxes with general traits. Instead of talking about culture, it is important to judge people as individuals, not just products of their environment." At first, this argument sounds valid, even enlightened. Of course, individuals, no matter their cultural origins, have varied personal traits. So why not just approach all people with an interest in getting to know them personally and proceed from them? Unfortunately, this point of view has kept thousands of people from learning what they need to know to meet their objectives. If you go into the every interactions assuming that the cultures doesn't matter, your default mechanism will be to view others through your own cultural lens and to judge and misjudge them accordingly. Ignore cultures and you can't help but conclude Chan doesn't speak up, obviously. He doesn't have to anything to say. His lack of preparation is running this training program, or perhaps Jake told me everything was great in our performance review, when really he wasn't happy with my work. His snacky, dishonest, incompetent, incom, incompetent boss. Yes, every individual is different. And yes, when you work with the people from other cultures, you shouldn't make assumptions about individual traits based on where a person comes from. But this doesn't mean learned about culture context is unnecessary. If your business success relies on your ability to work successful with the people from around the world, you need to have appreciations for cultural differences as well as respect for individual differences. Both are essential. As if this complexity weren't enough, culture and individual differences are often wrapped up with the differences among organizations, industries, professions, and other groups. But even in the most complex situations, understanding how cultural differences affect the mix may help you discover a new approach. Cultural patterns of behavior and belief frequently impact our perceptions, what we see, co- cognitions, what we think, and actions, what we do. The goal of this book is to help you improve your ability to decode these three facets of culture and to enhance your effectiveness in dealing with them. 8 skills that mapped the world cultures. I was not born in the multicultural family to parents who took me around the world. On the contrary, I was born out of the two harbors, Minnesota, most famous among drivers on the roads, leaving Duluth as the home of Betty's pies. It's the kind of small town where most people spend their entire life in the culture of their childhood. My parents were a bit more venturesome. When I was 4, they moved the family all of the 200 miles to Minneapolis, where I grew up. But as adults, I felt deeply in love with the thrill of being surrounded by people who see the world in dramatically different ways from me. Having now lived nearly half of my life outside of the United States, I've developed skills ranging from learning to eat muffin worms for an afternoon snack while teaching English to high school students in the Botswana, to dodging cows, chickens, and three-wheeled rickshaws during my morning run while on a short-term executive teaching stints in India. Today, married to the Frenchman and raising 2 children in France, I have to struggle with the cross-cultural challenges daily. Is it really necessary for an educated person to fold lettuce leaves before eating them, or would cutting the lettuce also be acceptable? If my very kind of stairs neighbors kissed me on the cheek when I passed them in the hall yesterday, would it be more cute? Would it be more cute for me to kiss them on the cheek the first time I passed them every single day? However, the lesson in this book emerged not from discussions about the lettuce leaves or muffin warmers, interesting as these may be, but from the fascinating opportunity to teach cross-cultural management in one of the most culturally diverse institutions on earth. After opening the French branch of a cross-cultural consulting firm, where I had the pleasure of learning from dozens of the culture specialists like Bo Chen on a daily basis, I began working as a professor at INSEAD, an international business school largely unknown in Two Harbors, Minnesota. INSEAD is one of the rare places where everyone is the cultural minority. Although the home campus is located in France, only around 7% of the students are French. The last time I checked, the largest cultural group was Indian, at about 11% of the overall students' body. Other executive students have lived and worked all over the world, and many have spent their careers moving from one region to another. When it comes to cross-cultural management, these global executives are some of the most sophisticated and knowledgeable on the planet. And although they have to insist to learn from us every day, I secretly learning from them. I've been able to turn my classroom into the laboratory where the executive participants test, challenge, validate, and correct the findings from more than a decade of research. Many have shared their own wisdom and their tested solutions for getting things done in the global world. This rich trove of information and experience informs the eight-scale model that is at the heart of this book. Each of the eight scales represents one key area that managers have must be aware, showing how cultures vary along a spectrum from one extreme to its opposite. The eight scales are communicating, low context, high context, evaluating direct negative feedback versus indirect negative feedback, persuading, principles first versus applications first, leading, egalitarian versus hierarchical, deciding, consensual or top-down, trusting, task-based versus relationship-based, disagreeing, confrontations versus avoids confrontations, scheduling, linear time versus flexible time. Whether you need to motivate employees, delight clients, or simply organize a conference call among members of the cross-cultural team, these eight skills will help you improve your effectiveness by analyzing the positionings of one culture relative to another. The skills will enable you to decode how influences your own international collaborations and avoid painful situations like the one in which Weber and Dulac found themselves caught. Let me give you an example of how understanding the skills might play out in a real situation. Imagine that Israel is good at working for a company that has just purchased a manufacturing plant in Russia. Your new position requires you to manage your group of Russian employees. At first, things go well, but then you start to notice that you're having more difficulty than you did with your Israel stuff. You're not getting the same results from your team, and your management style does not seem to have this positive impact if it did at home. Puzzles and concerned, you decide to take a look at the positions of Russian business culture on the eight skills and compared it with Israel culture. Wow, that is so different. Like among the eight skills, um, third one is persuading is so different, and leading is also so different, and yeah, that too is so different. The results back to the book. The results is the culture map show in the figure 1.1. The kind of the two will explore in detail in the chapters to come. As you review the culture map, you notice that Russian and Israeli business cultures both value flexible scheduling rather than organized scheduling. That is the skill 8. And both accept and appreciate open disagreement. That is the skill 7. And both approach issues of trust through a relationship oriented rather than a task orientation. Scale 6. This resonates with your appearance. However, you notice that there is a big gap between the two cultures when it comes to leading. Skill 4. And with Russian favoring a hierarchy approach, while the Israel prefers an egalitarian one. As we'll discuss in more detail later, this suggests the appreciations for the flat organizational structure and egalitarian management styles, so characteristics of Israel business people, may be ineffective in Russia's strongly hierarchical environment. Here is the clue to the different difficulties you've been having. You began to reconsider the common Israel attitudes that the boss is just one of the guys. You realize that some of your words and actions tailored to the egalitarian Israel culture may have been misunderstood by, by your Russian team and may even have been demotivating to them. In the weeks that follow, as you begin to make adjustments to your leadership style, you find that the atmosphere slowly improves, and so do the bottom line results. This is an example of how we use the 8 skills and the culture mapping process to effect genuine, powerful changes with organizations to the profits of everyone involved. So now I finished and I am the half of the page 18, so I will read more tomorrow, and today I read about that the 7 pages. It's quite meaningful. 안녕.